Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's DeSci Labs community call. We're starting a little bit late today because of a wonderful Future of Science seminar with Juan Benet on everything around the future of science and how Web3 and crypto economic networks can be beneficial to the scientific enterprise. So, with that, I don't think we have any massive updates today unless someone has something they want to chime in with. And I'm guessing that's a no. So sorry, I interrupted conversation a little bit earlier. Chris, what were you about to respond to John with?
No, I was actually really excited to start kicking off the post seminar discussion. A lot of things are crossing through my mind.
Same here too. So
Uh,
Juan brought up so many interesting ideas. I I can't wait to actually dive into some of them in the podcast. That like I have so many open questions, follow-up questions to the things that he said. One of the many ones being like, he was talking about how funding institutions should be more open to experiment with new funding mechanisms and just try out different things. And I completely agree, like 100%. The question is only like to which extent can we expect that large governmental institutions, large bureaucratic institutions are actually willing or able to do experimentation at all, or even at the large scale that is probably going to be needed for us to make serious progress in terms of discovering better funding mechanisms. So that remains an open question for me. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, for me too, it seems that, it's really interesting when you think of um, the emergence of the current scientific credit ecosystem, right? Peer review is such a novel thing. It really started taking off in the 60s and 70s during the time where Cold War funding was being poured into science and lawmakers were asking for returns. And it started as a way to justify having large budgets allocated to science. So it's really interesting. So you could think of a lot of the processes that are involved in allocative decisions by governments and large funding bodies actually serve first and foremost, a justification purpose, right? You have to justify why that money was spent, why such person received what amount, and you need essentially to have a fully justifiable audit trail so that you have some degree of protection and justification against, a lawmaker who's essentially, saying, well, we've been wasting taxpayer dollars and we shouldn't be investing into research in these fields and all these things, right? So it seems that the entirety of and a very large part of the modern scientific ecosystem is really driven by the need to justify the expenditure of public budgets. So if you take that hypothesis, it then becomes tricky for an allocator to say, hey, we're experimenting with different allocation mechanisms, right, at a large scale. The question is, of course, like you need to provide the allocator with a mechanisms of justification. That seems to be fundamental. And the question is like, how do you do that? Because we've seen there's numerous papers, there's plenty of empirical evidence showing that NIH grant reviews, they're not really very effective at selecting successful projects. And if you look at, there was this paper with the area under the curve, the ROC curves, and you could see it barely performs better than chance. And the consequence of that is like, you could say, well, let's just have a lottery.
Yeah.
And the amount of time saved by scientists who would not need to write these grant proposals and would just randomly receive money on their account, that would serve essentially, provide a tremendous amount of free man hours to do actual research. But how do you justify this?
Yeah. I mean, there is even an ongoing debate in academia about whether peer review itself is actually something that helped us or not, right? So there is at least some scientists who basically say that this introduction of peer review was like a gigantic scale uncontrolled experiment that we've been conducting on the scientific ecosystem, and that all the evidence suggests that this experiment has failed. So that
Yeah,
we
I linked.
better off with the system without peer review.
Totally. I linked an article in the peer review channel, "The Rise and Fall of Peer Review." I thought it was extremely compelling and very well written and very well argumented. And yeah, there's a case to be made. I mean, when you think about it, what has peer review done? You could even say that it contributes to aggravating the replication crisis.
Yep.
Think about it. You're publishing a paper, you almost got it through the journal, reviewer comes back and says, you know what, this paper is makes a compelling case, but it doesn't quite make the cut for that specific journal.
Right.
Unless
Exactly.
unless you manage to find a interaction with something I care about.
Yeah, exactly. Or like,
And
yeah,
then
you
you're like,
told me that this effect works for rats, but now I want to see it in tulips. And now, like as an
yeah.
author, you have to go back and do the same bloody experiment in tulips, and better make sure that the effect works, right?
Not even necessarily in Tulip, maybe even in your data set. And then as an author, you're like, damn, I need to show that result, right? And the reviewer, and what if the reviewer tells me, well, I have a negative result, therefore my paper doesn't make the cut. So you've just like dramatically increased the incentives to essentially, towards self-deception and p-hacking and harking and
Yeah,
all these questionable research practices, right?
exactly.
So it's there's a case to be made that peer review really aggravates mistakes in the scientific record, which is a really interesting thing when you think about it, because it's essentially the opposite of what it's supposed to do. And we know it's not very good at catching mistakes.
Yeah.
What we do know is that it's very good at creating conformity.
Mm-hmm.
And
Very
it's
true.
also very good at making people write in a certain way. A
Exactly.
way that
Like a
is
formula. Yeah.
yeah, it's very good at imposing social norms on others, right? So as a mechanism of social conformity, it's extremely powerful, because now you have to write in a specific way and care for every single word that you put down to ensure that it doesn't, run afoul of the peer reviewer's expectations. And there's also, tremendous amount of theory of mind that goes into it, right? Because think about the role of an editor in a journal. So an editor in a journal is attempting to predict whether or not, well, let's take a glamour journal, right? Is attempting to predict whether or not this work, this finding is of broad interest to the community, right? Meaning that it's going to translate in a high amount of citations down the line, right? That is going to have a high quote unquote impact, whatever that is, right? It's measured as citation counts, media appearance, these type of things. And so how do you make that call? Well, you have to have a model of what that community you're serving as an editor values. And so you have to form that mental model. And there's so you're essentially making predictions on what that community thinks is valuable.
Yeah.
And you're there to essentially aggregate. And there's also the fact that once you have peer review involved, it also somehow shields the editor from some degree of responsibility, because science is so complex right now. It's impossible to be an editor and have a deep understanding of the validity of the methods used, right? It's very impossible. Outside your niche, you basically have no chance. So you need to like invoke these third parties to make that call for you, essentially. And so all of that leads to a lot of reflexivity in the system.
Exactly. You're delegating responsibility in a large extent to the referees, right? So up to the extent where editors or grant review bodies sometimes only act as basically counting engines, right? So they don't really deeply engage with the material themselves anymore. They just basically count how many yes votes do they have, what's the average score of the reviewers, and then they rank the proposals or they make a decision about publishing a paper. Now,
Exactly. And it's like, when you're an author and you look at your peer reviews coming back, that if two of the peer reviewers are thumbs up and one is thumbs down, you think, oh, you're like, oh, I'm good.
yeah, exactly.
I passed a random draw. And when it's like, two thumbs down, one thumbs up, you're like, damn.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And then
it's
often,
like so arbitrary to some degree. It's such a dice roll, essentially. Right. And you end up, as an author, you end up being, mentalizing and making social predictions on what the likely reviewers that are going to be assigned your work are going to think about it, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of know who are going to be reviewing this, at least you have some model of who are the plausible reviewers, right?
Right. Everybody's guessing.
I know. It turns out to be like this incredible self-reflexive, theory of mind game you're playing with others who end up being also your competitors, right? So everyone's competing for the same grant money, and so they don't have an incentive to give you a thumbs up.
Yeah, exactly. And like in a way, you could even argue that the peer review system, as it's currently working, actually makes it less likely that paradigm shifting work will actually see the light of day. Because like what happens normally is that the editor or the reviewing body of a grant institution, they send out the proposals or the papers to people who are leaders in the field, right? And they're typically like well established and so on and so forth. Now imagine somebody comes along who's actually challenging a paradigm that they've been preaching for ages. The chances that the referees are going to come back and they're going to be outraged and they're going to say this is complete bullshit, like forget about it, or I don't believe these results, and they're going to fight it, right? Or like imagine we would have had a peer review when Copernicus claimed that the Earth is not flat, right? How outraged the establishment would have been about that. Right?
Well, Galileo got a taste of peer review by the church, right? It didn't exactly go as planned.
Actually, peer review by the church.
Yeah, like peer review by the inquisitors isn't like the best system we have.
Yeah.
No, it's really and the other thing is like, yeah, the people that do the review for the grants, they just they don't necessarily even want you to go down alternative paths, right? We had this big scandal with the beta amyloid hypothesis, which is exactly that, like complete gatekeeping of any grants that would suggest alternative causative mechanism for the disease, right?
Yeah.
Because the causative mechanism had to be the deposit of amyloid plaques in the brain. Yeah. And any causative mechanisms, any person that was saying, no, the amyloid plates are, a correlate of an other disease-causing mechanism, right? They're not the disease-causing mechanisms. Those got shut down hard.
Yep, exactly. And to make things even worse, then came out that the major boost that this hypothesis had came from this paper, which was based on fraudulent data, and it took them almost 2 decades to figure that out. Like,
oh yeah. We truly don't know the extent of fraudulent data in the scientific record, right? And it's very, very likely that the necessity of peer review has in fact backfired and increased the amount of fraudulent data in some insidious way. Now the question is, I think there was a really good point also brought up in that article, is like the idea, like what's your mental model of science? Is it like a weak link mental model, meaning that bad research drags everything down? Or is it a strong link mental model, meaning that that it's not the average level, but it's like the outlier, the best examples that drag everything up, right? That move the needle. It's clearly a strong link situation, right? Like you just have to accept that progress and knowledge, like new knowledge, is extremely difficult to find. And progress is going to be mostly driven by a few outliers that are worth it, that make everything worth it, because they shed some fundamental light on the nature of the universe. And there's a case to be made that, well, what we should actually be doing is accepting that there's going to be a lot of weak links. Essentially, think of preprint platforms. Preprint platforms take that exact approach in a way, right? They say, well, yeah, sure, there's going to be a lot of things that are outrageous and wrong, but there's also going to be all the things that are great and could really push the needle. They're going to be made available much sooner than if they were published in a traditional journal, which would take 6 months to a year to get out. And so that's the theory. So it's really interesting, and this ties up really well with the discussion, the talk that Juan gave, on how institutions should respond to this, which for me is very, very much. I'm not let's say I'm not highly optimistic for institutions to engage in large scale experimentations of different mechanisms. I do think it's possible. I think though that it's gonna essentially arrive like the cavalry, after new tools and new models to accelerate knowledge have become popularized from a bottom up way. But then they'll the hopefully the happy side effects of these new tools and new models will become adopted by major allocators.
Yeah, totally. So one of the things that Juan was talking about quite extensively in a seminar was the need for additional funding for science, and like he was talking about novel funding mechanisms, so new mechanisms to actually evaluate proposals and to allocate funds, but then also the need to just raise additional funds. And I think that he is completely right about that. So there is a part of economics that actually looks at that, and so in endogenous growth theory, so one of the central findings there is that if you have a knowledge production function with decreasing marginal returns, meaning that if it gets actually harder and harder over time to find good ideas, then in order to keep technological progress and economic growth going, you actually need to gradually increase the percentage of GDP that you're spending on R&D and the percentage of the population that is working in R&D and science, right? And to some extent, we are seeing that. So these things, they have been increasing a little bit over the last couple of decades, but the increase has been relatively slow. And there's increasing evidence that we actually do see decreasing marginal returns to investments into R&D. The open question is, of course, why do we see these decreasing returns? Is it that indeed it is just getting more and more difficult for us to find good ideas? Is it like, we basically picked all the low-hanging fruits and it just takes more and more efforts to get to the higher fruits? Or are there systemic problems in the way that we're currently funding and doing science that are contributing to these decreasing marginal returns? In any case, it seems to be pretty obvious that in order for us to maintain scientific progress and economic growth, we actually do need to increase the spending on science in total, also in terms of like a percentage of GDP that is going to that, which raises this big question. Where's that money going to come from? So yes, we have insufficient funding. Yes, there is all these new tools, but who will pay the bill at the end of the day, right? So Juan was hinting at the possibility of crypto networks playing a larger role in this over time. And I honestly love that idea. I hope that it's going to be true. But by the end of the day, it raises the questions, why should crypto companies or crypto networks, why should they act in a different way than traditional companies, right? So what is it really, is that a hope that is justified? Can we actually hope that the crypto system will manage to pull something off that neither governments nor private companies have actually managed to do so far, which is an efficient allocation of resources to R&D and an increase in R&D spending over time that is keeping up with the demands that we have. I'm actually really curious to hear what you guys are thinking about that. So for me,
I think absolutely, and it's not necessarily guaranteed efficiency; it's guaranteed scaling because it's run by an algorithm. So your metaphor between a crypto network and a company is not entirely perfect. It's more a crypto network is more like a nation, where you're minting a currency. So you can say, as the GDP of the network grows, as more people transact within this network, then more of the generated currency gets allocated directly to scientific research, and no one can change that. And then you can say, as the GDP increases, the amount of emissions that go to scientific research also decrease. You can make an algorithm that humans can't mess with.
Right, but I mean, so somebody would have to decide upon that algorithm, right? So there would need to be some sort of governance about what that protocol does and what that algorithm
Sure.
actually looks like.
And
Right?
you'd
Yeah, the
have
question is
6,000s of them existing simultaneously in parallel. So it would be a continuous experiment, and as one fails, there will be one that succeeds, and as one succeeds, there will be another that fails, and it's run by open source principles in the commons. It's similar to how Bitcoin's algorithm is run.
Are there examples of something like that already ongoing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
optimism like allocates a percentage of its fees to public good funding, for
Huh?
example. But the question at the end of the day is like, in a capitalist system, like there's no reason why these crypto networks would not have similar incentives, in the sense that if you have a competitor, let's say there's two scaling networks on Ethereum that do rollups or block producers, right? The one that allocates its funds in a more efficient ways to grow its products, all else considered, is going to beat the competitor who's allocating 50% of its revenue to like public goods, right? There's
Explain revenue. Why are we talking about revenue? If you're creating a currency, there is no revenue. It's not profit driven. It's like if the US printed like every time there was a recession, instead of the US printing dollars and then injecting that into the currency by giving it to banks who then lend it out into the economy, it's if the US printed dollars and gave that to researchers who are doing fundamental research and translative research that ends up bringing us out of the economy because it increases GDP. So there's no profit. It's just what you do with the currency once you mint it.
Well. The thing is, you need someone on the buy side of the deal, as always, right? So it's so the question is like,
Not with a currency. It's
well,
you need someone who interacts with it. You need someone to pay taxes with it, and that's what a transaction fee is. And you can build other fees in there. So Gridcoin also experiments with this, and we have like 2, possibly 3 in the future different fee structures where you must use the currency as it's essentially a tax. And the more people that want to use the currency because they agree with the value set, the more taxes get generated, which could say the GDP goes up, and that's how that functions.
oh, well, it depends. I guess it depends on the structure. I mean, if it's a Bitcoin style thing, or if it's a protocol that generates revenue for the protocol, like MakerDAO does, for example. Like, why would MakerDAO allocate a percentage of its revenues that should accrue to MakerDAO tokens to a public good, right? So the only case I would see for this happening is for extraordinarily profitable protocols. So I mean, it's not something that doesn't happen in the private sector today. I think we need to face this. Like companies like Microsoft or Google, they do spend a ton of money on fundamental research. But fundamental research that usually is somewhat aligned with some of their goals. They spend a lot on quantum computing, on AI, on doing translational R&D, but not only that, also a significant part on foundational R&D. And typically companies that have had monopolies in the past, like you had, for example, there's this famous example of Bell Labs, which ended, or Xerox, right? Which Xerox PARC or Bell Labs, they ended up being tremendous creators of fundamental research and fundamental innovation, because they were so profitable that they could afford to spend that amount of money on these public good like structures, right? Another concern I have is like, well, what do you do when interest rates are 4, 5, 6%, right? What do you do when the cost of credit is so high? Long-term moonshots and long-term capital commitments to high risk, potentially tremendously high reward projects, they become more difficult to justify to your base.
I could envision a protocol that does the exact opposite. As interest rates grow up, we stop spending money on something like the military, and we spend it on science instead. So you would have these two systems running in parallel, and one of them would be better than another at some point. But one doesn't overrule the other. One is better than the other at one point in time, and then at another point in time, the other one is better. And like you're able to fluidly, as a user of the world, like as someone who participates in these GDP producing nations that run on network and protocols, you're able to choose which protocol you want to use at any given point in time. So with your issue, which I think is a good one about why would a protocol allocate funds to science? Well, because people will use a protocol that's allocating funds to science or to public goods. That's a societal issue. Does society value science more than it values like football arenas, like sports arenas?
I mean that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. So it would be essentially just like how consumer might might pay double for an avocado, which has very little carbon footprint because they have some degree of social preference. That seller of avocado, which creates these extremely environmentally friendly avocados, can outcompete the seller of avocado, which doesn't care about the environment because of consumer preferences.
Exactly. Yeah, and
So that works. So it's a matter of like consumer preference in that case. But then we have to assume strong consumer preference. And what we know from consumers is that the ones that are actually willing, like still the vast majority of consumers just want the cheapest thing, right? But it's not an unviable model, right? There's some and it's also possible that the portion of the population that are sensitive to these things will continue to grow and increase.
So you build other things on top of it. So you build incentive structures that make people want to come in. One of the big things we try to do, and I think Juan is entirely correct, this is going to take like at least a decade to play out because these network nations need to get to the scale of small nation states to even see if the experiment will work. But there's several projects currently just tinkering around, seeing what could be possible. Gridcoin being one of them. And one of the things we do is we have that value set of science, and then we have an incentive structure that's distributed computing. So in order to, if there is a cohort of people who want to use that network because of the value set, there will be a cohort of people who want to get that currency because the currency has value. So if we make incentive structures where in order to get that currency, you have to do science, in this case, distributed computing in scientific direction, you've brought another way to grow the network. You have the value set, and now you have greedy people who are doing science just because they're greedy. So there's lots of different ways you can grow these networks that seem altruistic, and all you're really doing is utilizing greed.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how it play out, especially in an environment of high interest rates. Because in environments of high interest rates, this is where these cuts to non-fundamental things are done first. And which brings me, to the future of DeSci in general. It's like in an environment of expensive credit, it changes the rule of the game. It's no longer about, you can't really compete on funding very much because there's not that much cash flowing in the ecosystem. But what you can compete on is workflows and process to make systems more efficient. So that's where like products come in. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be, we're going to have to navigate all of these different angles to create like a successful system.
Yeah, and I agree with you when you're like that, when in your hesitation about institutions on whether or not they're actually going to be willing to experiment with this stuff. And I actually think a high interest rate environment where the focus is on increased efficiency on what we've already got might encourage them to experiment a little more, because they'll find ways. It's like this type of environment is when we develop technology that replaces human jobs, right? Because it's cheaper, it's more efficient. So I'm wondering what scientific institutions are going to be willing to experiment with different structures that sort of cut the flab out of their bottom line so that they can operate more efficiently. And there's a lot of potential for DeSci there too.
Yeah, the thing is, like, think about it. When nations are under stress financially, they tend to make cuts in domains that are considered non-essential, right? And the lawmakers and the funders of science and the NIH, and they have to fight really, really hard not to get their budget cuts, right? Because there's always going to be a lawmaker that says, hey, we should not be allocating that much money there where we have these other problems and risks of societal collapse or risk of people, having no food. We need to essentially make sure that we allocate our resources, our scarce resources, to domains that are necessities in the short run, which is completely understandable, right? Which is just a property of our system.
Absolutely. So maybe as NSF gets their funds slashed, or any of these institutions just run out of funding, they'll start looking around and seeing, oh, is there a way we can do publishing a little better, a little more efficient? And they'll look into the DeSci space and all the tools that are being built here over the next year or two, and maybe try and cherry pick a couple and experiment. Ultimately, I'm as pessimistic as you, but I do see a light of optimism, maybe, with high interest rates.
I think well, it's interesting how it changes the game, right? Because in a world of low interest rates, you can really attack the funding angle. You could say, hey, we're going to fund you, we're going to give you money, because money's cheap right now. And in a world of high interest rate, that's not really a card you can play. You have to say, no, we're going to give you more bang for your buck, right? More results for your dollars, so that you can cut while still having the same level of outputs, right? So these are like two different, completely different moods in these systems.
It's kind of interesting. An analogy that I've always heard along these lines is that when the river runs dry, you get to see where the rocks really are. So it's as you go through these points of high interest rates, folks who are in funding agencies on the lower levels, not the ones actively advocating for funding, can actually have a little bit more free time on their hands and can start to see where some of the problems actually are arising. So if you're in the right space at the right time, talking to the right people, which I understand that's a lot of ifs and is to a certain extent always the case, there's a lot more potential in this kind of a down market to make those connections. Where when money starts flowing again, it's a lot easier to actually implement some of these cost and time saving tools.
That's absolutely true, and that's a very interesting metaphor here. It is very possible. At the end, it's really it's really an interesting thing to think about the incentives of these organizations. One of the prime concern is to keep. So, if you listen to like the former, NIH head and director, like one of the prime concern is always, to try and increase the budget of the agency and especially prevent budget and funding cost, right? So a lot of the work that's done is there to is justification, right? You have to justify why you're spending these billions of dollars because these are ultimately tax dollars, right? So you have to justify that because everyone's competing for a slice of the budget. And it's really, and when the budget is tight and the interest rates are high and credit is difficult to obtain, like you say, it's going to reveal some rocks. And there's also a case to be made that it's during times of crisis when there's where things change. Because in a time of abundance, you might have, it's just going to change the nature of the experiments going on, essentially, and who conducts them.
You can relate, like every person can relate to this. As inflation goes up, as interest rates go up, as money gets tighter for like large institutions and systemics and system structures, and it gets tighter for individuals, you're going to find a more efficient way to get your food. You're going to maybe buy the more efficient packaging. You're going to buy in bulk. You're going to go to Sam's Club. You're going to buy your whole thing of meat and butcher it at home. You're going to find the more efficient way to do stuff. You're going to see the rocks and move them around. And then once money comes in again, you might not always go back to being that taking the wasteful route. You might still butcher your meat at home. You might still buy in bulk. So you as the water goes down, I also love this metaphor. you see the rocks that you can move around to make life easier. And then once the money starts flowing again, you see no reason to put the rocks back where they were when the water first went down.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting metaphor. Really curious where this is going to take us in general. But I do think it's a lot of that is just going to be we need to make productivity gains, right? The issue, though, and I think this is one of the main challenge why innovation in science and mediums of publishing and funding is so slow. It's because the feedback cycle is extraordinarily slow, right? So just think about the time it takes for citations to accrue to a paper. Think about the time it takes to go from, oh, I published all of this work and now I get, to pass the hiring committee and get a chance at having a tenured position. Think about the extreme timescales that are involved in these processes, right? So even if you improve a process by, let's say, 10%, by the time that 10% manifests itself, it's like it could even be hard to make the causal link with the intervention in the first place because it's so delayed. And it's so messy. So even if you have, randomized control trials, there could be a million things that happen in the meantime, So like measuring outcome measurements in the presence of very long feedback cycles are very difficult to do. And so that prevents, these kind of like evidence-based policies and this type of mechanisms, which are extraordinarily powerful at creating justification for organizations and large government institutions, right? From being able to be done. So it's and the other thing, it's so difficult in the presence of these extraordinarily long feedback loops. It's very difficult to make the case for the benefits of new systems, just because at the end of the day, scientists, they want to be able to grow their lab, they want to, get the tenure, they want to be able to essentially, there's a lot of concerns around just basic survival, right? It's a very constrained environment in terms of resources compared to the private sector.
And Chris, I'll say that from the perspective of funders, this is one of my favorite parts of what we're doing at DeSci Labs, is really thinking about the map to impact instead of just purely the mechanism itself. Because if you look at, let's say, the transportation industry, the biggest innovation over the past 2 decades in transportation itself has actually been Google Maps itself, I would say. It's not necessarily the electric car. From the standpoint of a user, I'm still going from A to B. It's not a new brand of tire or a new transmission. It really is an immediate and direct way to get where I need to go. And that's dependent on an abundance of data that underlies the actual transit itself collected by a large network of researchers or of travelers, excuse me. So to kind of tie that back in, I mean, essentially what the scientific record can and should be is a map to impact. It's a way for funders to actually justify the research, not only on a long time scale, but also on a short time scale to see, okay, this particular piece of scientific research has had code pulled from it 600 times over the past year. Sure, it's only got 20 citations, but this is an indicator that it's going to continue growing. So the idea that we have this predictive analytics is incredible.
So I mean, I think here you put your thumb straight on a very critical point, is like, given the extremely slow feedback loops, how can you create faster feedback? And I think that's really an important thing. And that's why like metrics, like alternative metrics like altmetrics are so successful, because it like measures, your Twitter exposure and like blogs and all these things that happen sooner compared to citations. We know the best predictors of future citations is number of downloads. So we have, a lot of analytical tools that can significantly shorten the time to feedback. And if you are able to like surface that information to funders so they can make better allocative decisions and they can justify, you know, their budgets better, it's definitely going to be a net positive. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Absolutely. And so we kind of had a call on this. It was myself, Sina, and Philip talking about quality control systems across industries maybe a month or so ago. It was a great call, and I've been thinking about it ever since, actually. The two critical items that make it difficult to do quality control on science are the feedback cycles, just sheerly the length of them, where it's going to take a decade for a paper to accrue all of its citations, and then the fungibility or the fact that science itself is non-fungible, that one experiment does not equal another experiment. And as we were going through different industries, we really touched on those two items quite a bit. But it was also interesting to hear Sina's perspective on software development and design and compare and contrast that with manufacturing, where in manufacturing you're going to have a fungible product where timelines are both incredibly short on the manufacturing line itself and then over a much longer time span with user feedback. Because if something breaks in a car, you've got a 3-year warranty. It's going to take 6 months for the part to actually get to the consumer. They have it for 2.5 years. It takes 6 months after it breaks to get it back. So it really is about bringing some of those almost manufacturing line style metrics into the beginning to enable predictive analytics. And that's one of the biggest issues with peer review that I've been able to kind of see is that it was never designed to be that manufacturing line style, I guess, quality control mechanism, but we're using it as such. Peer review is asked to do way more than it should. And it's not necessarily a bad mechanism. Like there are positives that come from peer review, no doubt, but it's asked to do too much without a supporting cast of QC. That is one of the bigger problems.
Yeah, I totally agree, Eric.
Absolutely, man.
Also, whenever you said that thing about Galileo, I cracked up. That one was good. But no, I mean, it gets into some of the work that Chris and Philip, the two of you have been espousing on the concept of replication studies, where there needs to be both short-term quality coming from, let's say, the tracking of data itself as it flows through the scientific process, where you can see the hashes of individual computations used by a scientist as a means of going back and checking their work on an immediate timescale. And then you can have kind of this medium term, the final check, where a human is looking over it to make sure that it's of a sufficient quality. And then on the back end, you have this customer feedback loop of replication studies themselves, which even portions of that can be automated with a machine readable scientific record. It's a huge part of what we're doing here is reimagining quality control for scientific research.
Yeah, I mean, at the technological side, it's especially, and I think, you know, I think, you know, any system that can shorten the feedback of the quality control is going to be of extraordinary value in general.
So we're building a virtual reality program that serves as a wet lab sandbox of sorts, where you'd be able to generate your protocol and kind of record your protocol in VR for someone else to conduct. And that'll be on, you know, kind of generated on a blockchain. All of the aspects of that research and of that protocol and technique would be kind of added to it as an addendum. But really, where this came from was from this whole reproducibility crisis. And I know we've taken a few directions in this conversation, but you know, from what Juan was saying, you know, this type of tool is really what seems to be necessary to address some sort of reproducibility, because a lot can can hamper reproducibility. But I would say that majority of it is human error. I mean, a lot of it can be, a contamination and et cetera. And a lot of the work I see in DeSci is really focused on computation, whereas I'm more interested in how to benefit the wet lab and science industry.
Oh man, the wet lab is a really tough nut to crack. With the way we've been thinking about it, like in a very simple way, is like one of the best way we were thinking of like improving reproducibility in wet lab experiment is, hey, how about you actually take your iPhone and you film your procedure? Because there's so much secret sauce going on. You like read the methods, in that paper published in Cell. It's like, oh yeah, just take region A, put a bit of region B, and ta-dam, this is gonna happen. It's like, no, there's like all this tacit knowledge happening, right?
Yeah.
And there's almost an incentive for people that do wet lab experiment, like to kind of like, be, hey, that's my tacit knowledge. I don't really want to share that tacit knowledge, And so there's reproducibility has a lot of incentives going against it. And in wet lab, because wet lab has a lot of like translational capability in pure dollars, right? Because of IP, drug discoveries, all of these things, right? This is where you there's a lot of like strategic papers, right, happening in the biotech space where like you have this new great immunotherapeutic marker or something, or like a new system to manufacture a specific type of antibody, and like the publishing experience is kind of a way to essentially kind of like start a potential for-profit venture, patent IP, these things, but you can't really give out all the sauce, otherwise you're shooting yourself in the foot. So you have like then all the tacit knowledge goes into the IP patent side, and you have methods which seem reproducible, but they're not, and they're not reproducible on purpose because you need to defend your commercial interests. And so
Yeah,
that's a tough nut to crack.
it is, and that is a huge kind of wind against us. This, because a lot of like you're saying, a lot of the work inside of the wet lab is very nuanced. It's very qualitative, and you're not able to write on the exact technique you use to resuspend primary cells. You have to resuspend primary cells before to really understand why you have to be so I guess careful and diligent. And there's only so much you can write. And so the idea for this really comes from the work that's been put into surgical simulations in virtual reality. The data that's come out shows that these surgeons have, after like a VR warm up of that protocol or of that surgery, they have 230% increased performance, 40% less mistakes, and they get done 20 to 40% faster. And so kind of extrapolating that idea from surgeons and bringing it to the bench, allowing for scientists to try these and practice these methods that doesn't matter what level they are. They could be new and just doing an ELISA or a Western blot, or they could be experienced scientists trying learning a new machine. There's a lot of nuanced and qualitative points in all of these trainings, and taking from that research we saw, which is in surgeons, which is based off of Edgar Dale, his cone of learning, which states that you remember 10% of what you read, 20% of what you see, but 90% of what you do. That's really where the data in surgeons, I think, is coming from, and that's where it can really benefit these wet lab scientists in a way that they're higher performing, which may lead to higher reproducible results. And then by publishing your results in virtual reality and allowing others to run through it and then do it in real life, that's really setting up for what we're trying to do to address reproducibility in life sciences. But it also has a sustainability component where you're not using as many reagents as you normally would if your trainees are running through a VR protocol, right? I mean, my graduate thesis, I had to run 15 experiments, 15 ELISAs of just one experiment, to get it right. And I, due to something or another, at least 10 of those failed, right? And each of those were $1,200, so $12,000 right down the drain, right there. And so this is a way to kind of increase retention of skill and comprehension of skill through these methods, and also publish those methods for higher reproducibility. And in VR, we're making kind of a sandbox, so you'd be able to MacGyver whatever you're doing, and allow them to be kind of holdable and functioning assets in virtual reality to really get those nuanced points of how to run the experiment and do the motions down.
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting in general. I mean, wet lab is a really tough nut to crack. I was shocked. So there's these AI companies that now that do like that check for image manipulation. And there's something absurd. There's something like 35% of papers published in the life science using Western blots have traces of image manipulation. Like, what the hell?
Wow.
It's just
Yeah.
it's like absolutely staggering, like fraud and Western blots. I mean, what is up with it with
Yeah.
Western blots, And there's like famous accounts like Elizabeth Bilk, and others just tracking all the fraud going on. And now that we have like these large scale like image detection software, literally, like they could run that on the entire scientific record of Western blots, and the result of this would be a complete and utter shock,
It's shameful. It's really shameful. It's creating a cascade of false hypotheses that are based off of a lot of this work, and we're just finding ourselves in a false nether where really the only research in the life sciences that's going to matter anymore is that going to be conducted by pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies that have the money to throw at basically building from scratch, right? But if you're building upon the current scientific knowledge base and you're building upon a fallacy, it's really dangerous.
The thing is, like this, the pharma industry is incentive, right? Sorry, what?
Can you please place the source on chat? You are talking about the fraud in life science. Can you put it on chat? The link to that research?
Yeah, let me find it. I'll look for it right now.
Yeah, I think there's one published in 2011 and one in 2012, and I think a more recent review was published in 2017 on like 1,500 life science papers. So yeah, there's a few of that out there. Let me see. I can pull this one. This one's from 2011. But yeah, that's a bit about what we're doing. And now, with how it relates to the conversation going on here is really trying to figure out how to tokenize these and provide incentive to these scientists who would be putting their protocols up, right? And they would have to be some sort of way that they are able to benefit through crypto framework from producing these protocols in VR, and then also for other people who validate that protocol and share their results towards a certain significantly similar results that would also benefit them, right? And so we're kind of, for that experiment with the quantities and concentrations and reagents listed, you should be getting similar results no matter where you get it in the world, right? And that's the beauty of science, and that's unfortunately what we're muddying. We're muddying that water, and we need to see some standardization.
Yeah, I mean,
this sounds like it's one of the most novel uses of the metaverse I've come across so far. It's very interesting. I have a challenge for you though, is if you're starting to dive into incentivization, do it without tokens. Try to figure out how to indirectly incentivize someone to do what you want them to do without paying them. Just don't pay them, because as soon as you pay them, you have muddied the water so much more. and there are ways to do it.
Yeah, and that's that's the difficult part too, right? Because you're not, now we're, with the current framework that we have, we need, this is kind of like a content creation platform. We're building an API, we're building the tools, the entire sandbox of, you have a wet lab, you'd be able to go there in sandbox mode and place your instruments, your LCMS, your reagents. You'd have all the different types of tubes and cells and things like that. But really, where a lot of our vital value and vital kind of work comes from is from these scientists who kind of have to but put forward their results from these experiments that are trying to be standardized in VR.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, right? Yeah, how do you incentivize a industry whose core contributors, who are the scientists, have been kind of I guess, for a lack of a better term, been kind of like betrayed by the peer review industry. When I was in the wet lab, when I was a scientist, I'm looking around me, I'm seeing these some of the most brilliant people I've ever worked with, and realizing how much they are being compensated and how many years they have to receive a compensation that I would think is fair of their degree and their technical prowess is just absurd. So unfortunately, I saw fiscal compensation and incentivization through cryptocurrency as a great way to kind of herald DeSci, number one, and number two, to give them to show them that that there's so much more in science, and that you should be compensated fairly for what you put forward in the world, right? And that's what I think peer review really got wrong. And
you're talking about two different things, though. There's paying someone for their work, and there's incentivizing someone with tokens. So when there is a very, very low chance that any token economic model that you create, and that even one that exists today, besides Bitcoin, there's a very low chance that they will exist in 5 years or 10 years. We don't know how to do it yet. Crypto economics is very, very difficult. So if you have a very good idea and then you root the success of that idea in a token economic model, you inject a lot of risk into the success of your idea, and your idea sounds very cool. So I think there is a way to pay people for their work fairly, which is, I think, a huge pitch for researchers in the space. Like, no, we're not going to pay you minimum wage to do science that changes the lives of 6 billion people around the world. We're going to pay you what you should be paid. There's a way to do that and not make your project rely on token economics.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, tokenomics are really, they could really be the bane of what we're building, right? However, we are primarily going to be focusing on academics, right? And that's why I was actually around here poking around and trying to see, going through Philip's Twitter as well, seeing what, and Mr. Handsome Bubblegum Sheep answered a lot of my questions. I think last week, about what DeSci Labs and DeSci Foundation and the DeSci community in life sciences are focusing on, because I think tokenomics can work. I think that they will work. I'm not going to say that every single crypto project that comes up in DeSci is going to last even a year. I'd say probably 98% of them are going to be gone, like you're saying, in 5-10 years. However, with DeSci in the nascent stage that it's in, I think that the one thing that's going to make tokenomics work is community and interoperability. And with what DeSci Foundation has come up with their nodes, is a huge boon for kind of the new way to share research. I think the part before that, the node of how it's peer reviewed, needs to have a DeSci lens, and then afterwards, how people are, I guess, compensated through kind of a royalty would be would be compensated as well. But that is a really hard conversation to have, and it needs to have the people that are at the table making the products to enable DeSci and in realms of science like life science to come together and decide, okay, what is that fair compensation model? Because
Right.
I don't think any of us are in DC and are going to be able to say, NIH, you need to up your game and give them more money for themselves or for their researchers.
Let's use nodes as an example then of how we're doing this without tokenomics or crypto economics. There's the idea of replication or attribute verification is that we'll use currencies that already exist. If someone wants a piece of research replicated or an attribute of a data set verified, like it's open data or whatever, they put a bid up and they say, here, I'll pay you 5 Ethereum to go and replicate or reproduce this research.
Yeah.
It's not that we have a token that says, here, you're going to get DeSci token for replicating this research. It's we've built a marketplace. Now, that's not to say that some crazy form of crypto economics won't exist in the future, where nodes is a part of it. But like that's not how we're building the product. Doesn't rely on that, and we're not even thinking about how to build that because there's a that can just be added later.
And so,
yeah, a good way to think about any form of incentivization as something the problem is like the moment you add explicit incentives to any system, you open yourself to attacks and abuse, and you also don't know if you're providing any value, right? Because what happens is like you obscure the signals of value creation, and that's a dangerous thing. So like the way we're thinking about it really is like, okay, we have to provide value to current researchers in their current situations facing current problems. And if we manage to create value there, then you have a system, right? You have something that has improved and moved the needle forward, right? So you make it easier to publish, you make it easier to store and share your artifacts, you make your work easier to credit. There's an entirety, there's a very large amount of value that is on the table that can be created for scientists to use, right? And any form of an extrinsic motivation will open the door to not just, well, you have Sybil exploiters, you have the obfuscation of value signals. It creates a tremendous amount of additional dangerous complexity in any system, essentially, especially if you're tackling something as critical and as sensitive as the discovery and verification of new knowledge, in which a lot of things rely on trust and good faith, and there's no way around it. There's just simply no way. The problem is, like, even if you store data, you have code, all these things, you can still cheat, right? It's like there's very you need good faith. You need good faith. So if you the moment you introduce external incentives, you essentially create distortions, and that distortions can go all the way up to affecting good faith, and then you have more frauds and more cheating, right?
And that's not what we want to do, right? We don't want to increase cynicism in science already, right? I mean, they're like, oh, brilliant, but I don't get paid enough, and now, okay, well, now I have to do this to get fair compensation, right? We don't want to do that. The tool is what's really important. How people are incentivized to use the tool is different. I mean, we can take a short-term and long-term approach to it, right? Short-term, maybe people would, start using the platform and the tool a lot more if they know they're going to get incentivized. Long-term, if there's no incentivization, adoption is really going to be a problem for us, and adoption, probably will be a major hurdle for us if we don't sell this right. But that's really something that I'd like to speak with DeSci Labs and DeSci Foundation a little bit more about is how can we promote this interoperability framework? The bids is something that I had thought about already as well, and if a new protocol is put up, then someone could go through and get compensated for addressing that bid. however, that's what it's about. We just lost our CTO. He just put in his 2 weeks last week. Actually, he was with us for 6 months, and some new opportunities came up for him. So we're down on that, but I really wanted to start this conversation, and maybe set a time with a few people at DeSci to really unravel a bit about what we're working on and our timeline, and how it can kind of fit in the bigger schema of DeSci and life science.
Yeah, man. And by the way, you're very welcome, and I really appreciate that you're dropping by and sharing these conversations. I think we're all, at the end of the day, we're all united in this very meaningful purpose, which is, hey, can we increase the rate of progress? Can we make science better? And I think that's like, there's a lot that can be exchanged on. Where are you based, by the way?
Based in Ohio, U.S.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, I was gonna say, come to DeSci London. There's this event in January, but it's gonna be fun.
I've been thinking about it. I have a good friend out there, and the nearest airport to me just got nonstop to London, so I'm tempted. I'm tempted.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting stuff, and just hang around and yeah, we'll keep exchanging on these topics, and yeah, very curious to see what you guys have built so far, and what you come up with, and very happy to share experience on all of these topics.
Thank you very much.
And with that said, though, I have to go. So nice talking with everyone today. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I will see you next week.